Keep moving. We're all
Hello
there.
and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, and get ready to drift off to sleep in peace. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. In the year Peanther comment, as autumn light thinned across the fields of northern Europe, a peasant family watched the horizon with a quiet, practiced dread. Winter was coming, and winter in the medieval world was not simply a season to be endured. It was an adversary. It could take a harvest, a herd, home, or a life, and it rarely announced itself with mercy. Long before the first frost touched the soil, entire villages had already begun a race against time, one that it had been rehearsed for generations, and that left almost no room for error. To understand how ordinary people survived the cold centuries before central heating, insulated windows, or synthetic fabrics existed, we have to set aside modern assumptions. The medieval peasant did not think of winter as a temporary inconvenience between warm seasons. Winter was a test of preparation, community, and knowledge passed down through hands coalesced by generations of labor. Survival was not an accident. It was the result of thousands of small, deliberate decisions made months before the first snowfall. And it depended on systems that today feel almost invisible to us. The design of a home, the placement of a fire, the sharing of body heat with livestock, the rhythm of a meal, and the unwritten rules of a community that understood instinctively that no household could make it through February alone. This is the story of how they did it, not through luxury, but through ingenuity. Not through comfort, but through resilience built into every wall, every garment, and every relationship between neighbors. It is a story about heat, but more than that, it is a story about survival as a craft, refined over centuries by people who had no other choice but to master it. Chapter Icky, Reading the Sky, Preparing the Ground. Long before the cold arrived, medieval communities were already at work. Preparation for winter did not begin in November. It began as early as midsummer, when the fields were still golden and the sun still warmed the land for long hours each day. Farmers watched the sky with an attentiveness that modern life has largely forgotten. Cloud patterns, wind direction, the behavior of birds and insects, and the timing of the harvest moon all carried meaning. These were not superstitions in the way we might dismiss them today. They were an accumulated, practical science, refined through generations of trial and error, in a world where a misjudged planting season could mean starvation months later. The agricultural calendar of the Middle Ages was built entirely around this looming threat. Grain had to be harvested, threshed, and stored before there were the autumn rains to rot. Hay had to be cut and dried to feed livestock through months when no green pasture would be available. Wood had to be gathered and split, not in the panic of the first cold snap, but steadily, over weeks, so that it had time to dry and would burn efficiently rather than smolder uselessly. A green, unseasoned log was almost worthless in the depths of January. Villagers understood this, and so autumn became a season of relentless labor, every task governed by the silent countdown toward the first frost. Root cellars, dug into hillsides or beneath the floors of homes, were filled with turnips, cabbages, onions, and other vegetables that could survive the cold without spoiling. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried since fresh meat could not last, and the animals that could not be fed through winter were often slaughtered in the late autumn, their meat preserved to sustain the household when the ground was frozen solid and no crops could grow. This period, sometimes remembered by later generations as the time of slaughter, was not born of cruelty, but of necessity. Every choice was a calculation: which animals to keep for breeding, milk, or labor, and which could not be spare the father needed to keep them alive until spring. By the time the first true frosts silvered the fields, a well-prepared household had already transformed its barns, cellars, and storerooms into a fortress against hunger. The battle against winter, in many ways, had already been half won or lost long before the snow itself arrived. Chapter Uch: Building Walls that Remember at the Cold. The homes of medieval peasants were not built for beauty. They were built for survival, and every design choice reflected a deep, practical understanding of how heat behaves and how cold intrudes. Long before anyone understood that the physics of thermal insulation in scientific terms, builders across Europe had already discovered, through centuries of lived experience, how to construct a dwelling that could hold onto warmth. Most peasant homes were small, and this was intentional. A smaller enclosed space is easier to heat than a large one, and so families, sometimes numbering 6, 8, or more people, lived closely together within a single main room or a small cluster of rooms. Ceilings were kept low, since heat rises, and a lower ceiling meant that the warm air generated by a fire or by the bodies of the household stayed closer to where people lived and slept, rather than escaping upward into unused space. The materials themselves were chosen with the climate in mind. In regions with abundant timber, homes were built using a wooden frame filled wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches packed with a dense combination of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Once dried, this created walls that were surprisingly effective at trapping heat and blocking wind, far more so than the untreated wood alone could have managed. In colder regions, particularly across parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, Locustan Europe, log construction became common, with thick timber walls that provided a natural thermal mass, absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. Roofs were most often thatched, using layers of straw, reed, or heather packed tightly enough to shed rain and snow while trapping a cushion of insulating air within the material itself. A well-made thatched roof could last for decades and provided a surprisingly effective barrier against the cold, far better than the thin, exposed slate roofs, sometimes assumed to have been universal in this period. In fact, slate and tile, while more fire-resistant, were often considered colder and were more commonly used in wealthier or urban buildings, while thatch remained the practical choice for those most exposed to the elements. Windows, where they existed at all in a peasant home, were small, few, and could be closed with wooden shutters or covered with animal skins or oiled cloth, since glass remained an expensive luxury far beyond the means of most rural households. Every opening in a wall was a potential loss of heat, and so doors were kept low and narrow, and thresholds were sometimes built up slightly to prevent cold air from creeping directly across the floor. Perhaps most tellingly, many peasant homes were built partially into the earth itself, with floors set below ground level, or with walls banked with soil, turf, or manure on the exterior. The earth, once past its outer frozen layer, maintains a relatively stable temperature, and by building into or against it, medieval builders were unknowingly applying a principle that modern earth-sheltered architecture still uses today. This was not accidental brilliance. It was the product of trial, failure, and adaptation across countless generations who had learned, often at great cost, exactly what kept a family alive through the coldest months. Chapter Dart, the hearth at the center of life. If the walls of a medieval home were its armor against the cold, the hearth was its beating heart. In nearly every peasant dwelling across medieval Europe, the fire was not simply a source of warmth. Was the organizing center of daily life, around which cooking, working, sleeping, and even social gatherings revolved. To understand medieval winter survival is to understand the central, almost sacred role that fire played in every household. In the earliest and simplest homes, the hearth was an open fire built directly on the floor, usually near the center of the main room, with smoke rising to escape through a hole in the roof or through gaps beneath the eaves. This design, often called an open hall arrangement, allowed the heat of the fire to radiate in all directions and to rise upward, warming the entire volume of the room, including any loft space used for sleeping or storage. The trade-off was smoke, which filled the upper reaches of the home and left soot darkening the roof timbers, a small price that families accepted in exchange for warmth that reached every corner of their modest living space. Over the centuries, particularly from the late medieval period onward, a significant innovation began to spread through parts of Europe: the wall-mounted fireplace with a proper chimney. This design moved the fire to one side of the room and directed smoke upward through a flue, reducing the choking haze that had filled earlier homes. While chimneys became increasingly common in the homes of wealthier peasants, artisans, and townspeople by the later Middle Ages, many poorer rural households continued to rely on the only older open hearth design well into later centuries, simply because building and maintaining a chimney required resources, masonry skill, and materials that were not always available. Fuel itself was a constant and serious concern. Wood remained the most common fuel across much of Europe, but it required careful management. Villages depended on collective rites to gather dead wood and fallen branches from nearby forests, rites that were often carefully regulated by local custom or law to prevent the depletion of a resource upon which every household depended. In regions where wood was scarce, particularly in parts of the British Isles, dried peat cut from bogs became an essential fuel, burning slowly and steadily with a distinctive, lasting heat. In some areas, dried animal dung, mixed with straw and shaped into blocks, served as a supplementary fuel, particularly among poorer households who could not afford to be selective about what would keep them warm. The fire was rarely allowed to go out entirely, especially during the coldest months. Embers were carefully banked each night, covered with ash to preserve their heat and slow their burn, so that in the morning they could be coaxed back into flame with dry kindling, rather than requiring an entirely new fire to be struck from scratch, a task that was far more difficult and time-consuming with the flint and steel methods available at the time. This careful, continuous tending of the household fire was often a shared responsibility, and the knowledge of how to keep a fire alive through the night was a skill passed from parent to child as essential as any other domestic craft. Around this fire, in the deep cold of a winter evening, families did far more than simply keep warm. They ate their meals, mended tools and clothing, told stories, and passed down the oral traditions, songs, and practical knowledge that held their culture together. The hearth was, in every sense, the true center of the medieval household, and its warmth radiated far beyond mere physical comfort into the very structure of family and community life. Chapter Baif, living alongside the animals. One of the most striking aspects of medieval winter survival, and one that often surprises modern observers, was the close physical cool relationship between peasant families and their livestock during the coldest months. In many rural homes across medieval Europe, particularly in regions with harsh winters, animals were not kept in separate pet barns at any meaningful distance from the family dwelling. Instead, they were often housed within the same building, sometimes separated from the human living space by nothing more than a low partition or a shared open floor. This arrangement, sometimes referred to by later historians using the term longhouse, placed animals such as cattle, pigs, goats, and chickens at one end of the dwelling, while the family lived and slept at the other. Far from being simply a matter of convenience or lack of space, this design served a genuinely practical thermal purpose. Livestock generate significant body heat, and a stable field with several large animals could raise the ambient temperature of an attached living space substantially, providing a natural and continuous source of warmth that required no fuel and no tending through the night. This practice was not universal, and its prevalence varied significantly across regions and across social classes. In some areas, particularly among slightly wealthier peasant households, animals were kept in a separate, but closely adjoining structure, allowing some of the residual heat pass through a shared wall, while keeping the smells and mess of livestock somewhat apart from daily family life. In other regions, especially in the coldest climates of Northern and Eastern Europe, the fully shared living arrangement remained common well into the later medieval period, a direct and unromantic response to the brutal mathematics of survival, where the warmth of a cow could mean the difference between a bearable night and a dangerous one. Beyond warmth, this closeness to livestock served other winter survival functions as well. It allowed families to monitor their animals closely. During a season when losing even a single cow or a handful of chickens to cold or illness could have serious consequences for the household's food supply and economic stability in the following year. It also meant that the labor of feeding and caring for animals, itself a significant winter task, could be carried out without venturing far from the shelter of the home during the most dangerous weather. Historians examining the archaeological remains of medieval peasant dwellings have found constant evidence supporting this practice across much of rural Europe, from the British Isles through the Low Countries and into parts of Scandinavia and Central Europe, with variations shaped by local climate, available building materials, and evolving social customs across the centuries. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of medieval winter survival, fundamentally interconnected. The household that survived not simply through human ingenuity alone, but through a working, symbiotic relationship between people and the animals upon which their livelihood depended. Chapter Alt: Dressing for the Cold. Clothing in the medieval world served a purpose far more urgent than fashion. In the depths of winter, what a person wore could genuinely determine whether they lived or died, and the garments of medieval peasant presence reflected centuries of accumulated practical knowledge about how to trap heat, block wind, and manage moisture using the materials available to them. Wool formed the foundation of medieval winter clothing across nearly all of Europe, and for good reason. Even when damp, wool retains a significant portion of its insulating properties, a crucial advantage in a world without modern waterproofing, and where rain, snow, and sweat were unavoidable realities of daily outdoor labor. Peasant families raised sheep specifically for this purpose, and the processing of wool, from shearing through carding, spinning, and weaving, occupied a substantial portion of household labor throughout the year, much of it aimed directly at preparing for the coming winter. Layering was the essential strategy. A typical peasant dressing for cold weather might wear a linen undergarment against the skin, valued for its ability to wick away moisture and its relative comfort compared to wearing wool directly against the body. Over this came one or more woolen layers, often including a tunic and an over-tunic, followed by an outer garment such as a heavy wool cloak or coat, sometimes lined with fur, for those who could afford it. Multiple thinner layers trapped pockets of warm air between them, a principle of insulation that remains just as valid today as it was in the 14th century, even though medieval people understood it through practical experience rather than scientific theory. 4. While often associated with wealth and status in the medieval imagination, was not entirely absent from peasant winter wear. Rabbit, sheepskin, and other more affordable furs were sometimes used to line hoods, mitts, mittens, or the interior of cloaks, providing critical warmth for extremities that were particularly vulnerable to frost. Hands and feet, along with the head, lose heat rapidly, and medieval people understood this well. Even without modern knowledge of circulatory physiology. Woolen mittens, sometimes lined with fur or fleece, protected the hands, while sturdy leather boots, often stuffed with straw for additional insulation, protected the feet from both cold and the damp ground. Headwear was considered essential rather than optional. Hoods, caps, and coifs made of wool or lined with fur covered the head and often extended down over the neck and shoulders, since a significant portion of body heat is lost through an uncovered head. For those working outdoors in the fields or tending livestock through the winter months, additional wrappings of cloth around the lower face and neck provided protection against biting wind. A practical precursor to what we would now recognize as a scarf. Clothing was also, out of sheer necessity, treated as a precious and long-lasting resource. Garments were mended repeatedly, passed down between family members, and repurposed as they wore out, with the least damaged sections cut away and resewn into smaller items such as mittens or patches for other clothing. Nothing was wasted in a world where the labor required to produce even a single length of woolen cloth, from raising the sheep through the final stitch, represented weeks or months of accumulated effort. Chapter Yibin, the long task of feeding a household. Hunger and cold were, in the medieval mind, deeply intertwined dangers, and the struggle to maintain an adequate diet through the winter months was inseparable from the broader struggle to survive the season itself. A malnourished body loses heat more rapidly and has far less capacity to fight off the illnesses that spread readily through cold, crowded winter dwellings. Feeding the household, therefore, was not a separate concern from staying warm. The medieval winter diet relied heavily on foods that could be preserved through the autumn months and would last without spoiling until spring finally brought new growth. Grains, stored dry in sealed containers or granaries, formed the backbone of most peasant diets, ground into flour for bread or boiled into potages. Thick stews that could incorporate whatever vegetables, grains, and small amounts of preserved meat a household had available. This single dish, cooked slowly over the hearth fire, often for hours, served the practical purpose of extracting maximum nutrition from limited ingredients, while also making efficient use of the fire's heat for both cooking and warming the home simultaneously. Preserved meats and fish played a critical role in sustaining households through the coldest months. Pork, in particular, was commonly salted, smoked, or both, and could be stored for extended periods, providing essential fat and protein during a season when fresh meat was scarce and difficult to obtain. In coastal and riverside communities, fish was similarly served through salting, smoking, or drying, and drying or salted fish became a dietary staple across much of medieval Europe, particularly important given the religious calendar's frequent days of fasting from meat, which fell disproportionately during the winter and early spring months. Root vegetables such as turnips, parsnips, and onions along with hardy cabbages, could be stored through winter in cool, dark cellars, providing crucial vitamins and variety to a diet that would otherwise have consisted almost entirely of grain and preserved meat. Dried legumes, including peas and beans, offered another valuable source of protein that could be stored for extended periods without spoiling, and these were frequently incorporated into the potages that formed the daily fare of most peasant households. Dairy, where available, was similarly transformed into forms that could survive the winter. Milk itself spoiled quickly and was primarily a seasonal product tied to the calving and lambing cycles of livestock. But cheese, produced and aged during the more abundant months, could be stored and consumed gradually throughout the winter, providing a invaluable and relatively stable source of protein and fat. Beyond mere sustenance, the preparation and sharing of food carried significant social weight during the winter months. Communal ovens, where they existed within a village, allowed households to share the labor and fuel cost of baking bread, a task that consumed considerable firewood if attempted individually by every family. The rhythms of eating, cooking, and preserving food through the winter were not simply about individual survival, but were woven into the fabric of community cooperation that, as we will see, proved essential to making it through the season alive. Chapter 6. No one survives winter alone. Perhaps the most important truth about medieval winter survival is one that is easy to overlook amid discussions of hearths, clothing, and stored grain. No single household, however well prepared, could reliably survive the harshest winters entirely on its own. Medieval rural life was fundamentally communal, and this interdependence became most visible and most vital precisely when the cold was at its worst. Villages functioned as networks of mutual obligation and shared resources. The communal management of woodland, often governed by customary rights that dictated how much timber or deadwood each household could gather, ensured that fuel, one of the most precious resources of winter, was distributed in a manner that, however imperfect, aimed to prevent any single family from being left entirely without means to keep warm. Similarly, agreements around shared pastoral land and the timing of harvests reflected a broader understanding that the community's survival through winter depended on the survival of each of its constituent households. When misfortune struck an individual family, whether through illness, the loss of a breadwinner, or the failure of a harvest, neighbors and the broader village community often stepped in with practical support, whether through shared food, temporary shelter, or assistance with the physical labor that our weakening household could no longer manage alone. This was not simply altruism in the abstract sense. It reflected a practical recognition that a community's overall resilience through the winter depended on limiting the number of households that fell into complete crisis, since destitution, illness, or death within one family could quickly create burdens that rippled outward to affect others, whether through the spread of disease, the loss of shared labor, or the strain placed on already limited communal resources. Religious institutions, particularly local parish churches, and, where present, monasteries, also played a meaningful role in winter survival for the most vulnerable members of medieval society. Almsgiving, the charitable distribution of food, clothing, or shelter to the poor, elderly, and infirm, was considered both a religious obligation and a practical necessity, and many monastic communities maintained stores specifically intended for distribution during the leanest and coldest months of the year, when the gap between subsistence and crisis was at its narrowest for the poorest members of a community. Winter also brought communities together in less formal but equally significant ways. With outdoor agricultural labor largely suspended by the frozen ground, the colder months became a season for indoor communal work, such as spinning, weaving, and the repair of tools and equipment often carried out in shared spaces, where the labor of several families could combine with the shared warmth of a single well-tended fire, reducing the fuel burden on any individual household, while allowing skills, stories, and news to be exchanged during the long winter evenings. This deep-rooted culture of mutual reliance was not born of idealism. It emerged from the hard, repeated lessons of a world where winter was an annual test that no household could be entirely certain of passing alone, and where the difference between a community that endured and one that suffered catastrophic loss often came down how effectively its members had learned to depend upon one another. Chapter 2: When the Fire Was Not Enough. Despite centuries of accumulated knowledge and careful preparation, winter in the medieval world remained a season of genuine peril, and not every household, and not every winter ended in survival. Understanding the full picture of medieval winter life requires acknowledging the very real dangers that persisted despite every precaution, and the ways that particularly severe winters could overwhelm communities. Illness spread readily during the winter months, aided by the close confinement of families within small, poorly ventilated homes, often shared with livestock, where the smoke of the hearth fire mixed with the crowded conditions to create an environment conducive to respiratory ailments. Malnutrition, even in households that had prepared carefully, could set in gradually over the course of a long winter as stored food reserves dwindled toward spring, leaving people more vulnerable to illness precisely at the point when winter's grip remains strongest and new food sources weeks or months away. Particularly severe winters, sometimes associated with broader climatic shifts across the medieval centuries, could devastate even communities with strong traditions of preparation and mutual support. Extended periods of extreme cold could kill livestock despite every effort to shelter and feed them, destroy stored grain through unexpected damp or vermin, or simply extend far beyond the point at which even carefully rationed food stores had been calculated to last. Historical records from various points across the medieval period document years of exceptional hardship, when famine followed a catastrophic harvest, or an unusually harsh and prolonged winter, reminding us that the systems of survival described throughout this account, however sophisticated, operated within real limits, and could be pushed beyond their capacity by circumstances
outside human control. The very young and the very old face the greatest danger during these crises, their bodies less able to withstand the combined stresses of cold, reduced nutrition, and disease that characterized the hardest winters. Infant and child mortality, already significant in the medieval period under ordinary circumstances, often rose further during particularly difficult winters, a somber reminder of the genuine stakes involved in the preparations and precautions described throughout this narrative. It would be a distortion of history to present medieval winter survival purely as a triumph of ingenuity without acknowledging this darker reality. The elaborate systems of home construction, fuel management, food preservation, clothing, and communal support that developed across medieval Europe existed precisely because winter posed a genuine, recurring threat to life itself, one that claimed victims even among those who had done everything within their power and knowledge to prepare. Chapter on An Inheritance of Practical Wisdom. The story of how medieval peasants survived the freezing winters is, ultimately, a story about human adaptation under sustained and unforgiving pressure. Without the technologies that we now take entirely for granted, medieval communities developed a comprehensive, interconnected system of survival built on architectural knowledge, careful resource management, textile craftsmanship, dietary planning, and deeply rooted social cooperation. Each element reinforced the others, and none could be fully understood in isolation from the whole. The low, thick-walled homes built partially initially into the earth, the carefully tended hearth fire that burned at the center of daily life, the shared warmth between families and their livestock, the layered woolen clothing that trapped precious body heat, the painstaking preservation of food through the autumn months, and the deep communal bonds that ensured no household faced the worst of winter entirely alone, together formed a remarkably sophisticated response to one of the most persistent challenges faced by any pre-industrial society living through a temperate or northern climate. Much of this knowledge did not disappear with the passing of the medieval period. Elements of these building techniques, food preservation methods, and even the basic principle of layering natural fibers for insulation persisted in rural communal communities across Europe for centuries afterward, gradually refined but rarely entirely abandoned until the arrival of industrial heating, modern insulation materials, and global food distribution networks transformed the relationship between ordinary people and the cold in ways that would have seemed almost miraculous to a peasant family huddled around a hearth fire 7 centuries ago. What remains most striking when we look back on this history is not any single technology or technique, but the sheer depth of accumulated, practical understanding that ordinary people developed and passed down across generations, entirely through observation, experience, and the harsh discipline of necessity. They did not have central heating. They did not have insulated glass or synthetic fabrics or refrigeration. What they had was knowledge, hard-won and carefully preserved, and a community bound together by the shared understanding that surviving winter was a task no one could face alone. In the end, that may be the most enduring lesson of this history. Warmth in the medieval world was never simply the product of a well-built fire. It's the product of preparation that began months in advance, of walls and roofs designed with genuine understanding, of clothing crafted with painstaking care, and above all, of communities that recognized their survival as fundamentally intertwined. The peasants of medieval Europe did not conquer winter. They learned, generation after generation, how to endure it together. Chapter 11: A Continent of Different Winters. To speak of medieval winter survival as a single, uniform experience would be to overlook one of its most important truths. The medieval world was vast, and its winters were not one winter, but many. The strategies that kept a family alive in the highlands of Scotland bore only partial resemblance to those used along the sun-warmed coasts of southern Italy. And understanding this diversity reveals just how finely tuned human adaptation had become to local conditions across the medieval centuries. In the far north, across Scandinavia, the Baltic lands, and the northernmost reaches of the British Isles, winter was long, dark, and unforgiving in ways that shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Here, homes were built with especially thick timber walls, often using a construction method that interlocked heavy logs to create walls of considerable mass capable of holding onto warmth for extended periods, even as outside temperatures plunged far below freezing for weeks at a time. Turf roofs, layered thickly over a wooden frame, provided a degree of insulation that thatch alone could not match in such severe conditions. And the short hours of winter daylight meant that
These structured much of their indoor labor and social life around the hearth fire for a far greater portion of each day than their southern counterparts ever needed to. Moving southward into the Great Plains and river valleys of Central Europe, from the Low Countries through the German-speaking lands and into much of France, Winters were somewhat milder, but still demanding, characterized by damp cold, frequent frost, and the ever-present threat of flooding as reverse froze and thawed unpredictably. Here, the wattle and daub construction described earlier reached its most refined form, and the collective management of woodland resources became especially sophisticated, since these more densely populated regions faced greater pressure on their forests than the more sparsely settled north. In the Mediterranean world, spanning much of Italy, southern France, and the Iberian Peninsula, winter posed a markedly different, though still genuine, challenge. Temperatures rarely approached the brawl extremis found further north, and heavy snowfall was, in most years, a rare event outside the mountainous interior regions. Yet, Mediterranean winters carried their own particular danger, since homes in these warmer climates were often built with an emphasis on managing summer heat, featuring thinner walls, higher ceilings, and larger openings designed to encourage airflow, features that offered little protection when winter's cold rains and occasional frosts arrived. Mediterranean peasants relied more heavily on portable heat sources, such as small braziers filled with charcoal, and on the simple strategy of concentrating daily life in the smallest, most easily warmed room of the house during the coldest weeks of the year, a markedly different rhythm from the northern household that lived almost entirely around a single central hearth throughout the winter months. In the mountainous regions that stretched across the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Carpathians, entirely distinct traditions emerged shaped by extreme elevation, difficult terrain, and prolonged desolation once snow closed the mountain passes. Alpine communities developed building traditions that combined heavy stone lower walls, providing thermal mass and protection against avalanches and heavy snow loads, with timber upper structures, and villages in these regions often stockpiled supplies with particular care, since a severe snowfall could cut off access to neighboring settlements and outside markets for weeks or even months at a stretch. Eastern Europe and the vast expanse of the vast principalities presented yet another set of conditions, with some of the most extreme cold found anywhere on the continent. Here, the sunken, earth-banked dwelling described in earlier chapters reached perhaps its most essential and widespread form in the use of the stove. A substantial masonry structure capable of retaining heat far longer than an open hearth fire became an especially important development, allowing a single well-built fire to warm a home for many hours after the flames themselves had died down, a technology that would gradually spread westward across the following centuries. This regional diversity reminds us that medieval winter survival was never a single static set of techniques, but rather a living, evolving body of knowledge, constantly adapted to local climate, available materials, and the particular character of each region's landscape, refined over centuries by communities who had no choice but to understand their environment with an intimacy that few in the modern world would ever need to replicate. Chapter Amik, Firelight and Festival in the Darkest Months. For all its hardship, the medieval winter was not experienced purely as a season of grim endurance. Woven through the practical struggle for warmth and survival was a rich thread of celebration, ritual, and communal joy, deliberately positioned within the calendar to sustain morale through the darkest and coldest stretch of the year. Understanding medieval winter survival requires understanding not only how bodies were kept warm, but how spirits were kept from breaking under the weight of prolonged cold, darkness, and confinement. The period surrounding the winter solstice held particular significance across medieval Europe, inherited in part from older pre-Christian traditions and gradually woven into the Christian liturgical calendar as the celebration of Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas, extending from late December into early January, became a sustained season of feasting, community gathering, and temporary relief from the relentless labor and rationing that characterized much of the winter months. Households that had carefully preserved food throughout the autumn often set aside a portion specifically for this celebratory period, understanding intuitively what we might now describe in psychological terms. That a community facing months of hardship needed periodic moments of genuine joy and abundance to sustain its collective resilience. These festivities were far from frivolous distractions from the serious business of survival. They served concrete social functions, reinforcing the bonds of community and mutual obligation that, as we have seen, proved essential to a winter survival in more practical terms as well. Shared feasts brought households together under a single roof, pooling resources and combining the warmth of multiple family hearths worth of gathered people into shared celebration, while games, music and storytelling provided entertainment that required no fuel and no scarce resources beyond the presence and goodwill of neighbors. Storytelling itself deserves particular attention as a winter survival strategy in the broadest sense. With the working day shortened by limited daylight and outdoor labor largely suspended by frozen ground, winter evenings around the hearth became a primary venue for the oral transmission of a community's history, values, practical knowledge, and entertainment. Elders shared stories that had been passed down for generations, and in doing so, quite literally kept alive the accumulated wisdom, including much of the practical knowledge about surviving winter itself, that had allowed their community to endure season after season. Religious observance, too, provided structure and meaning throughout the winter months. The rhythm of the liturgical calendar, with its fasts and feasts, gave shape to the passage of time, during a season when the natural markers of agricultural life, so central to the rest of the year, largely fell silent. Attendance at church services provided regular occasions for community gathering, and the promise of eventual spring reinforced through religious symbolism, and the specific timing of key celebrations offered psychological sustenance through the bleakest stretches of the year, when the practical business of survival could otherwise feel like an isolated, grinding struggle with no clear end in sight. Even amid genuine hardship and real danger, then medieval communities understood something essential about human endurance: that survival was not purely a matter of calories, fuel, and shelter, but also of maintaining the social bonds, shared meaning, and periodic joy that allowed people to face the remaining weeks and months of cold with renewed resolve rather than despair. Chapter on Urch: Understanding Illness in a Cold World. Medieval understanding of health and illness differed profoundly from our own, rooted not in modern medical science, but in a framework known as humoral theory, inherited largely from ancient Greek and Roman medicine and elaborated upon throughout the medieval period by scholars across Europe and wider Mediterranean world. Yet, despite this very different theoretical foundation, medieval people developed a substantial body of practical observation about the relationship between illness, and the body knowledge that shaped how they responded to the health challenges that a winter inevitably brought. According to humoral theory, the body was understood to be governed by a balance of 4 fluids, or humors, each associated with particular qualities, including heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Winter, understood as a cold and moist season, was believed to naturally increase the phlegmatic humor within the body, associated with these same cold, moist qualities, and medieval medical guidance frequently recommended dietary and behavioral adjustments intended to counteract this seasonal imbalance. Warming foods, including spiced wines, hearty meat dishes, and dried fruits, were considered particularly appropriate for the winter months, a recommendation that, whatever its theoretical basis, aligned reasonably well with the practical nutritional needs of a body working harder to generate heat in cold conditions. Beyond this theoretical framework, medieval communities developed considerable practical knowledge about specific cold-related ailments through direct, repeated observation. Frostbite and chilblains, the painful inflammation of skin caused by repeated exposure to cold, damp conditions, were well recognized, even if not understood in modern physiological terms, and various remedies, ranging from warming ointments to specific dietary recommendations. Attempts to treat and prevent them. The particular vulnerability of extremities, including fingers, toes, ears, and nose, to cold damage, was well understood through direct experience, reinforcing the practical emphasis on well-insulated mittens, footwear, and headwear described in earlier chapters. Respiratory ailments, unsurprisingly common given the smoky interiors of many peasant homes, combined with the close, crowded winter living conditions shared with other family members, and often with livestock as well, were a persistent winter concern. Various herbal remedies, often involving warming or drying herbs, consistent with humoral theory's emphasis on counteracting winter's cold, damp qualities, were employed in attempts to treat coughs, congestion, and related complaints, with varying degrees of actual effectiveness by modern medical standards, though certainly reflecting genuine and careful observation of symptoms and attempted remedies, refined over generations. Malnutrition-related illness, though not understood in these specific terms by medieval physicians, was recognized in its effects, even if not always correctly diagnosed in its cause. The weakness, susceptibility to other illness, and slow healing associated with inadequate nutrition were observed, and, to whatever extent resources allowed, addressed through efforts to maintain dietary inadequate food quantity, even as stores dwindled toward the end of the season, reflecting a practical wisdom about nutrition that existed well ahead of any formal scientific understanding of vitamins or need. Local healers, midwives, and, in wealthier households or in proximity to monastic institutions, more formally trained physicians, all played roles in addressing winter's particular health challenges, drawing on a combination of inherited theoretical frameworks, practical herbal knowledge, and the accumulated observational wisdom of communities that had, out of sheer necessity, become remarkably attentive students of cold affected the human body, even without the biological understanding that would only emerge centuries later. Chapter on Dirt, the Manor, the Lord, and the Machinery of Winter. Medieval rural society was not composed simply of independent peasant households acting alone, but was structured across much of Europe by the manorial system, a hierarchical arrangement in which peasants held and worked land in exchange for various obligations owed to a lord, whether in the form of labor, a portion of their harvest, or other dues. This system, whatever its broader social and economic implications, also shaped the practical realities of winter survival in significant ways, both easing certain burdens and imposing others. Manorial estates often maintained resources and infrastructure that individual peasant households could not have sustained alone. Communal ovens and mills, mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, were frequently manorial property made available to peasant households in exchange for a fee or a portion of the resulting flour or baked goods, allowing the fuel-intensive work of grinding grain and baking bread efficiently rather than duplicated wastefully across every individual household. Similarly, larger stores of grain and other provisions, maintained at the manor itself, sometimes served as a buffer against the worst effects of a poor harvest. Whether through direct distribution during times of genuine crisis, or through the Lord's own practical interest in maintaining productive, surviving peasant workforce upon which his income ultimately depended. The obligations owed by peasants to their lord, however, also shaped winter preparation in ways that could work against individual household resilience. Portions of the harvest, owed as rent or tribute, reduced the amount that a peasant family could set aside for its own winter stores and labor obligations, requiring peasants to work the Lord's own land or perform other duties at specified times, could compete directly with the time and effort household needed to devote to its own preparations for the coming cold season. The precise balance of these competing pressures varied enormously across different regions, different periods of the medieval era, and different specific manorial arrangements, and it would be a mistake to treat the manorial system as uniformly beneficial or uniformly burdensome with respect to winter survival. Woodland and other natural resources essential to winter preparation, including the timber and fuel wood discussed in earlier chapters, were frequently subject to a manorial control, with specific customary rights governing what peasants could gather and under what conditions. These rights, sometimes codified through long-standing local custom and sometimes subject to dispute or gradual erosion over the medieval centuries, represented a crucial point of negotiation and occasional tension between peasant communities and the lords who held all authority over the land. Since access to adequate fuel represented, quite literally, a matter of life and death during the coldest months, the lord's own household and the manor house itself typically enjoyed considerably greater resources for winter comfort than the surrounding peasant dwellings, including larger and more elaborate fireplaces, greater quantities of stored fuel and food, and often better constructed buildings with more substantial insulation. This disparity, stark as it was, existed within a broader system in which the lord's own prosperity remained genuinely dependent on the survival and continued productivity of the peasant population working his land, creating at least some degree of practical incentive, however imperfectly, in practice, for lords to take an interest in the winter survival of the communities under their authority. Chapter Ombet, Monasteries as Havens Against the Cold. Across medieval Europe, monasteries occupied a distinctive and often crucial position within the broader landscape of winter survival, serving simultaneously as centers of charity, repositories of practical and medical knowledge, and in many regions, significant agricultural and economic enterprises in their own right. Their role in helping communities endure the winter months deserves particular attention, both for what it reveals about medieval social structures and for the genuine, practical assistance it often provided to those most vulnerable to winter's dangers. Monastic rules, particularly those governing the Benedictine tradition that shaped much of Western European monasticism, explicitly emphasized hospitality and charity toward travelers and the poor, obligations that took on particular urgency during the winter months when travel became more dangerous and the needs of the destitute grew more acute. Many monasteries maintained dedicated facilities for receiving and caring for travelers, the sick, and the poor, providing shelter, food, and warmth to those who might otherwise have faced the winter cold entirely without protection or support. The agricultural operations of many monasteries, often conducted on a larger and more systematically organized scale than typical peasant landholdings, allowed for correspondingly larger and more reliable food surpluses, at least eased in favorable years, which could then be directed toward charitable distribution during the leanest winter months. Monastic granaries, cellars, and storehouses, benefiting from the accumulated labor and organizational capacity of a religious community, rather than a single family, sometimes maintained reserves capable of providing meaningful relief to surrounding communities during periods of particular hardship, whether caused by a poor harvest, unusually severe winter, or other misfortune. Beyond direct charitable provision, monasteries served as important centers for the preservation and transmission of practical knowledge relevant to winter survival, including agricultural techniques, food preservation methods, and medical knowledge inherited from classical antiquity. Through generations of monastic practice, monastic infirmaries, staffed by monks or nuns with particular training in the medical knowledge of the period, provided care for the sick, including those suffering from the cold-related ailments discussed in an earlier chapter. And monastic herb gardens, carefully maintained even through the winter months in protected, growing spaces, supply the raw materials for many of the remedies employed in treating such conditions. The physical construction of monastic buildings themselves often reflected considerable sophistication in managing winter cold, with substantial stone construction, carefully designed heating systems for key communal spaces such as the calefactory, a room specifically designated and heated for the comfort of the community during the coldest months, and organized systems for fuel gathering and management that could draw on the collective labor of the entire monastic community rather than the more limited resources of an individual peasant household. It would be a mistake to romanticize the monastic role in winter survival entirely, since the actual scope and consistency of charitable provision varied enormously across different monasteries, different regions, and different periods of the medieval era, shaped by each institution's own resources, priorities, and circumstances. Nonetheless, for many medieval communities, and particularly for the poorest and most vulnerable individuals within them, the presence of a nearby monastery represented a genuine and sometimes crucial resource in the annual struggle to survive winter's cold. Chapter Onyx: Winter through the eyes of the youngest and the oldest. While the practical strategies of home construction, food preservation, and communal cooperation applied across an entire household, the actual experience of medieval winter varied considerably depending on age, and the very young and the very old faced particular vulnerabilities that shaped how families and communities directed their care and limited resources during the coldest months. Infants and young children faced some of the greatest risks during medieval winters, as a reality reflected starkly in the mortality patterns recorded, where available, across the medieval period. Infants possess a limited capacity to regulate their own body temperature and depend entirely on the care and attentiveness of parents and other caregivers to remain adequately warm, adequately fed, and protected from the illnesses that spread readily through crowded winter households. Swaddling, the practice of wrapping in infants tightly in cloth, served a warming function alongside its other traditional purposes, and infants were typically kept close to the hearth fire and to the body warmth of their mothers or other caregivers throughout the coldest periods, reflecting an intuitive, practical understanding of an infant's particular vulnerability to cold, even without any formal medical knowledge of infant thermoregulation. Older children, once past infancy, gradually took on age-appropriate responsibilities that contributed directly to the household's winter survival, from gathering kindling and tending the fire to assisting with food preparation, and, as they grew older still, participating in the broader agricultural and craft laborer that sustained the family throughout the year. Childhood in the medieval world was not, for most peasant families, a period of extended leisure separate from the practical work of survival, and children's contributions, calibrated to their developing abilities, formed a genuine and necessary part of how households managed the demands of the winter season. At the other end of life, elderly members of medieval households, where they survived to advanced age, brought accumulated experience and practical knowledge that held genuine value for a community's winter survival, even as their own physical vulnerability to cold and illness often increased with age. The transmission of practical winter survival knowledge from the specifics of home construction and maintenance to food preservation techniques, and the reading of seasonal and weather signs discussed in an earlier chapter, often flowed primarily through elder members of the household and community, whose decades of accumulated seasonal experience represented a genuinely valuable resource that younger generations relied upon, particularly when facing conditions or decisions that fell outside the routine patterns of an ordinary year. Caring for elderly or infirm family members during the winter months placed real additional demands on already stretched household resources, from fuel and food to the physical labor of care itself. And the practical realities of these demands sometimes create genuine tension within families, communities operating with limited margin for error. Yet the same communal structures of a mutual obligation and support described in an earlier chapter often extended to include support for elderly individuals without close family able to provide adequate care, reflecting a broader medieval understanding rooted in both practical necessity, religious and cultural values, that the survival and reasonable well-being of a community's most vulnerable members remained a genuine collective responsibility. However imperfectly and inconsistently this ideal was actually realized across the enormous diversity of medieval communities. Circumstances. Chapter on the trades that kept winter at bay. While the peasant farmer stood at the center of medieval rural life, and an entire constellation of specialized trades and crafts contributed essential goods and services that made effective winter survival possible, and particular rhythms of these trades were often shaped directly by the demands and opportunities that winter itself created. The blacksmith held a position of particular importance within many medieval villages, producing and repairing the metal tools and fittings upon which so much of winter preparation depended, from the access and sauce needed to gather and process firewood to the various iron fittings incorporated into home construction and repair. Blacksmithing itself, conducted around a forge fire that generated substantial heat, became, somewhat incidentally, one of the warmer places within many medieval villages during the coldest months, and the smithy sometimes served as an informal gathering place during the winter season, combining productive labor with the practical benefit of shared warmth. Millers, who operated the water-powered or wind-powered mills responsible for grinding harvested grain into flour, performed work of obvious and direct importance to winter food security, and the careful timing of grain processing typically concentrated in the weeks following harvest, but continuing in smaller measure throughout the winter as households ground additional flour from their stores as needed, represented an essential link in the chain connecting the autumn harvest to the bread that would sustain families through the following months. Weavers and textile workers, whose labor connected directly to the wool production discussed in an earlier chapter, often found the winter months, with outdoor agricultural labor largely suspended, to be a particularly productive period for spinning and weaving, transforming the wool sheared, processed earlier in the year into the finished cloth that would become the clothing and blankets essential to surviving the cold. This concentration of textile labor during the winter months reflected a practical logic, making efficient use of a period when other forms of productive outdoor work were largely unavailable, while directly producing goods of immediate and critical importance to the household's own winter survival. Charcoal burners, who produced the specially processed fuel valued for its high heat output and relatively clean burning compared to raw wood, conducted at work that, while less common among ordinary peasant households than the simple gathering of firewood, supplied an important fuel source, particularly valued by blacksmiths and other craftspeople whose work demanded higher, more controlled temperatures than an ordinary domestic hire could easily provide. Thatchers, whose specialized skill in constructing and repairing the thatched roofs described in an earlier chapter required years of accumulated expertise, performed essential maintenance work, typically concentrated in the more favorable weather of late summer and early autumn, ensuring that at villages' homes entered the winter season with roofs capable of of providing the insulation and weather protection
upon which so much of household survival ultimately depended. Together, these specialized trades formed an interconnected economic and practical system that extended well beyond any single household's own labor and resources, illustrating once again the fundamentally communal and interdependent nature of medieval winter survival, in which the specialized skill and labor of the blacksmith, the miller, the weaver, and the thatcher each contributed essential threads to the broader fabric of a community's collective ability to endure the cold. Chapter 18: The Centuries When Winter Grew Harsher. Medieval winter survival strategies did not develop and remain static across a single, unchanging climate. Across the many centuries of the medieval period, Europe experienced meaningful shifts in climate that placed varying degrees of pressure on the survival systems described throughout this account, and understanding these broader climatic patterns adds crucial context to the human story of adaptation and endurance. The earlier centuries of the medieval, roughly spanning from around the 9th through the 13th centuries, are generally associated by climate historians with a period of relative warmth across much of Europe, sometimes referred to as the medieval warm period. During these centuries, generally milder winters and longer growing seasons contributed to agricultural expansion, population growth, and the settlement of some marginal lands, including parts of the North Atlantic, that would prove considerably more difficult to sustain during the colder centuries that followed. Beginning gradually around the 14th century and intensifying across the following centuries, Europe experienced a pronounced shift toward a colder climatic period, now generally referred to by historians and climate scientists as the Little Ice Age, a phase of generally lower average temperatures that persisted with considerable regional and yearly variation into the 19th century. This shift brought more frequent severe winters, shortened growing seasons, and an increased frequency of harvest failures across much of Europe, placing genuine and sustained pressure on the winter survival systems that communities had developed during the preceding, somewhat more forgiving, centuries. The early 14th century in particular saw a period of catastrophic agricultural failure across much of Northern Europe, now often referred to as the Great Famine, driven by a sequence of unusually severe and prolonged periods of adverse weather that devastated harvests across successive years, overwhelming the food storage and community support systems described throughout this narrative, and resulting in widespread death from starvation and related disease across affected regions. This period stands as a stark historical reminder that even the most sophisticated and well-developed systems of winter preparation, refined over generations, could be overwhelmed when climatic conditions moved sufficiently far outside the range for which those systems had been calibrated. In the centuries that followed, as the cooling trend of the Little Ice Age continued and, in various periods, intensified further, European communities continued to adapt their winter survival strategies in response, including further refinements to home construction and heating technology, including the gradual spread of the more efficient masonry stove design mentioned in an earlier chapter, along with continued evolution in agricultural practices aimed at building greater resilience against an increasingly unpredictable and often harsher climate. This long climatic history reminds us that the story of medieval winter survival was never a fixed, unchanging tale, but rather an ongoing process of adaptation in which each generation inherited the accumulated practical wisdom of those who came before, while also facing the particular climatic and social circumstances of their own era, refining and adjusting inherited strategies in response to conditions that could and did shift meaningfully across the long centuries of the medieval period. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment.